What's most frightening about America's children today isn't what they're doing. It's that more and more adults in completely different places have started telling the exact same story. Nearly 70% of 8th grade students in the United States are not reading at a proficient level. Around 6 million children have been diagnosed with ADHD. But those numbers are only the tip of the iceberg. Behind them are mothers breaking down in tears after trying everything they could and still not being able to help their child. They're teachers who have decided to walk away from the classroom after years of watching students lose the ability to focus, regulate their emotions, and communicate. To the point where America's leading medical organizations have collectively declared a national emergency in children's mental health. So what really happened to an entire generation? And is America losing its own children's childhood without even realizing it? Something is happening in America that even many parents don't know how to describe. The first people to realize something was wrong with children weren't doctors. They weren't teachers. They weren't researchers. They were the parents themselves. That might sound obvious, but the unusual part is something else. In the past, when a child was struggling, parents looked for advice. They asked doctors. They talked to the school. They read books. They tried different approaches, believing there would always be an answer somewhere. Today, more and more parents aren't looking for advice anymore. They're simply begging for someone to give them an answer. Perhaps no story captures that better than a video shared by a mother in Kentucky. She wasn't a neglectful parent or someone who handed her child over to a screen. Quite the opposite. She works in healthcare. She understands ADHD. She knows which signs need early intervention, and she understands what can happen if the most important stage of a child's development is missed. So she did almost everything the experts recommend. Her child went to occupational therapy. She worked closely with the school. She put discipline strategies in place. She saw a pediatrician. She sought out a child psychiatrist. She read the research, watched the guidance, and kept searching for more information. But after walking through all of those doors, the only thing left was a feeling of helplessness. What made millions of Americans stop and pay attention wasn't the child's behavior. It was the mother's desperation. Because she wasn't asking, "Where should I start?" She was saying, "I've done everything I know how to do." Those are two completely different sentences. According to the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, around 6 million children between the ages of 3 and 17 have been diagnosed with ADHD. But ADHD is only a very small part of a much bigger picture. In recent years, hospitals, clinics, and schools across America have all reported a clear increase in anxiety, emotional disorders, and behavioral problems among children. The situation has become serious enough that the American Academy of Pediatrics, the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, and the Children's Hospital Association jointly declared a national emergency in children's mental health. But perhaps the most thought-provoking part isn't the numbers. When someone without medical knowledge feels helpless, we might assume they simply need more information. But when even someone who works in healthcare, understands the healthcare system, understands ADHD, and has done almost everything that's recommended, no longer knows what to do next, then the problem probably isn't limited to just one family anymore. Something has changed in the very definition of childhood. And if parents were the first to notice it, then the next question is, what changed in childhood itself? What changed before those children changed? Perhaps the answer doesn't begin with a phone. It begins with the disappearance of a childhood that America once considered completely ordinary. Not long ago, an American child's afternoon usually ended when the streetlights came on. Parents didn't have to text and ask where their kids were because they already knew. The kids were somewhere in the neighborhood, maybe riding their bikes, playing at the local park, or hanging out in a friend's backyard. Not every afternoon was exciting. Sometimes there was nothing to do. But those moments that seemed so uneventful quietly taught children things that no classroom could ever replace. They learned how to invent their own games when no one was there to entertain them. They learned how to work through disagreements without an adult standing beside them to settle every conflict. They learned how to wait, how to fail, how to try again, and how to discover their own limits. Most importantly, they learned how to live in a world that wasn't designed just for them. For thousands of years, childhood happened wherever other people were. On neighborhood streets, in parks, on school playgrounds, or on front porches. Those were the places where children watched adults, learned to read facial expressions, listened to the silence between conversations, and slowly figured out how the world worked. Then everything began to change. Not because a new app appeared, not because the smartphone was invented, but because the place where childhood happened moved. Years later, psychologist Jonathan Haidt described that shift with a simple idea. America had moved from a play-based childhood to a phone-based childhood. This wasn't just a change in technology. It was a change in the entire environment where children grow up. For the first time in modern history, a huge part of childhood was no longer happening between people. It was happening between a child and a screen. According to Common Sense Media, American children between the ages of 8 and 12 now spend an average of about 5.5 hours a day on screen entertainment. For teenagers, that number rises to about 8.5 hours a day, not including time spent on schoolwork. A day still only has 24 hours. So every hour that appears on a screen is also an hour that disappears from somewhere else. There's a paradox that's hard to ignore. Children have never been able to connect with so many people as they can today. With just a few taps, they can talk to friends, watch the lives of people on the other side of the world, or join enormous online communities. But at the same time, never before have so many children spent so little time in the world right in front of them. What's remarkable is that phones didn't take childhood away in a single day. They quietly replaced it one small moment at a time. An afternoon outside became an afternoon in a bedroom. Knocking on a friend's door became sending a text. A quiet moment long enough for imagination to come alive became an endless stream of entertainment. Each change by itself seemed small. But when those changes repeated every day for years, childhood itself gradually began happening somewhere else. And perhaps that was the biggest change of all. Phones didn't just change how children entertain themselves. They changed where childhood happens. And once the place where childhood happens changes, the next thing to change won't just be daily routines or habits. It will be the way an entire generation learns to see, feel, and respond to the world around them. One high school teacher said the thing that surprised her most wasn't students using their phones during class. What truly shocked her was movie day. Years ago, it was always the class everyone looked forward to the most. But now, just a few minutes after the movie begins, many students are already looking down at their phones. The movie is still playing. The sound is still there. But for many of them, it has become nothing more than background noise while their brains keep searching for something newer. This is no longer the story of just one classroom. More and more parents, teachers, and education experts are describing the same pattern. Many children and teenagers are finding it harder to stay focused on activities that move at the normal pace of everyday life. Reading a few pages of a book, listening to a long conversation, or patiently waiting for their turn has become more difficult than it used to be. What's important to understand is that real life hasn't slowed down. What has changed is the pace the brain has gradually learned to expect. In neuroscience, the brain's reward system helps people learn by creating a sense of anticipation when something interesting is about to happen. That mechanism is completely normal and essential. The problem begins when small rewards are delivered too often. Every swipe reveals something new. Every notification brings another surprise. Over time, the brain starts adapting to that pace and begins expecting the next reward to arrive within just a few seconds. That's why many researchers aren't focused only on how much time children spend on screens. They're also paying attention to the pace of stimulation children experience every day. Once the brain becomes accustomed to constant rewards, the real world starts to feel different. A 45-minute class, a family dinner without phones, a line of people waiting to check out, or simply sitting still for a few minutes. Not because those things have lost their value, but because they no longer deliver something new quickly enough. Some pediatricians in the United States have also reported seeing more children brought in for headaches, stomach aches, insomnia, or ongoing fatigue. After ruling out physical causes, many of those cases have been linked to stress, anxiety, lack of sleep, or prolonged overload. That suggests not every change begins with a disease. Sometimes it begins with the way the body responds to the environment it lives in every day. Perhaps the most important point is that no one is born needing a new experience every few seconds. That's a rhythm that develops gradually over time. And once the brain becomes used to that rhythm, the gap between the world on a screen and the world outside keeps growing wider. Real life hasn't become slower than it used to be. The brain has simply become accustomed to a world that moves much faster. That's also the point when the changes no longer affect attention alone. They begin to show up in the way an entire generation responds to waiting, to disappointment, and to the people around them. One month, millions of Americans heard the name Kia Challenge for the first time. At first glance, it looked like just another internet joke. A few teenagers discovered that certain older Kia and Hyundai models could be started with very simple tools. Within a short time, tutorial videos spread at incredible speed. Then, what began as a challenge on a screen quickly showed up in parking lots, on city streets, and in local news reports. What's striking is that many of these incidents didn't begin because of money. Not to sell the car, not to carry out a planned professional crime, but to record a video, to post it online, to see how many views, likes, and shares it could get. That's the part that has drawn the most attention from behavioral experts. Not because of the Kia, not because of a USB cable, and not simply because of a social media platform. What's worth thinking about is that when the reward on a screen becomes valuable enough, the consequences in the real world can sometimes begin to fade into the background. For years, online platforms have been designed to reward content that grabs attention. The more shocking, surprising, or risky something is, the more likely it is to be shared. For most users, those are just videos they watch and scroll past. But for some teenagers, whose emotional development and impulse control are still maturing, being noticed by other people can become an incredibly powerful reward. A video with hundreds of thousands of views, an account that gains thousands of new followers, a challenge spreading across an entire school. Those are all social signals with enormous influence. Meanwhile, the real consequences usually arrive later. A crash, a criminal record, a family losing the only car they have to get to work, or worse, the loss of a life. It's not that today's teenagers don't understand the difference between right and wrong. Most of them do. But adolescence is a stage when the brain is still developing its ability to assess risk and control behavior. When that process combines with an environment where every action can be recorded, shared, and rewarded almost instantly, the way young people perceive rewards and consequences can begin to change. Perhaps that's one of the biggest changes of the smartphone era. In the past, many moments existed only between the people who were there. Today, every moment has the potential to become content. A front-facing camera is always ready. A post button is always within reach. A generation that grows up with this can sometimes begin to see the world as a stage where what matters isn't just what they're doing, but how many people will see it. And when an action is judged first by how viral it becomes rather than by its consequences, those changes no longer stop with individuals. They begin putting pressure on the very places that were built to raise and protect children. That's when schools, teachers, and the entire education system begin to feel the first cracks. The bell rings. Students file out of the classroom. The room slowly becomes quiet again. But the teacher stays seated for a few more minutes, not to grade papers, not to prepare the next lesson, just to regain their composure before the next class begins. That has become an increasingly familiar scene in schools across America. There was a time when a teacher's job was fairly straightforward. They came to class to teach reading, writing, math, and help students understand the world. Challenges always existed, but most of them revolved around one question: how do we help students learn better? Today, many teachers say the first question is no longer how to teach the lesson. It's how to make the lesson begin at all. The stories shared under #TeacherQuitTalk are only the tip of the iceberg. Thousands of teachers say what has burned them out isn't that they've stopped loving their profession. What wears them down is that more and more of every class period is spent calming conflicts, helping students regulate their emotions, reminding them to pay attention, or simply trying to keep the classroom quiet enough for learning to continue. A classroom can only teach when it's quiet enough for learning to begin. And for many teachers, that seemingly simple requirement has become the greatest challenge of all. National data reflects the same picture. According to the National Assessment of Educational Progress, NAEP, reading and math scores for American students have still not returned to their pre-pandemic levels, while the percentage of students reading at a proficient level remains a major challenge. Those numbers aren't just about academic performance. They reflect the growing gap between what students are expected to achieve and what many of them are actually able to do when they walk into the classroom. At the same time, technology continues to change the way learning happens. Never before have students had so many tools to help them learn. In just a few seconds, an artificial intelligence system can write a paragraph, summarize a book chapter, or answer almost any question. That creates enormous opportunities. But it also leads many teachers to ask another question. If a machine can do too many of the steps in the learning process, how much opportunity do students still have to develop patience, express themselves clearly, and think independently? Perhaps the most thought-provoking part is that schools are gradually taking on responsibilities that didn't entirely belong to them in the past. Teachers aren't just delivering knowledge anymore. They're also spending more and more time teaching students how to listen, how to regulate their emotions, how to resolve conflicts, and how to live alongside others in a community. That isn't a failure of teachers. It's a sign that the changes that began in childhood, then spread to the way the brain responds, have now reached the entire education system. And when a school no longer has enough time to teach everything a child needs to learn, the next question will no longer be what students know. It will be what they never had the chance to learn from life outside the classroom. Perhaps the most troubling thing about America's children today isn't what they know. It's what they've never had the chance to learn. Not in a textbook, but in everyday life itself. A manager at a Wendy's once shared that what surprised him most about some younger employees wasn't their lack of work experience. What puzzled him was how uncomfortable many of them were making eye contact with customers, starting a simple conversation, or handling an unexpected situation without step-by-step instructions. Those skills may seem small, but they never just appear when someone turns 16 or 18. They're built through thousands of conversations, thousands of observations, and thousands of ordinary moments throughout childhood. The same pattern has shown up at indoor playgrounds like Catch Air. Many parents say children are finding it harder to wait their turn, becoming frustrated more easily when they lose a game, and quickly losing interest when things don't go their way. That isn't proof that this generation is worse than the one before it. It simply shows that many of the experiences that once taught children patience are gradually disappearing. Think about the little things: counting cash to buy a bag of potato chips, standing in line without holding a phone, knocking on a friend's door, looking a stranger in the eye and saying, "Hello." No school lesson ever taught those things. Life used to teach them, and that's what's changing. We often call it common sense, but common sense isn't a school subject, and it can't be downloaded like a new app. It's built little by little through waiting, making mistakes, awkward conversations, and those ordinary afternoons when children explored the world around them on their own. A child doesn't learn patience just by hearing adults talk about patience. A child learns it by waiting their turn. No one learns how to read another person's emotions through a screen alone. That only happens when we look into a real person's face. Perhaps that's why the biggest question is no longer how well children today know how to use technology. The bigger question is which experiences disappeared while they were growing up. Because in the end, what shapes an adult isn't just what they learned. It's also what they lived through. Common sense isn't downloaded. It's built over time. And it's very hard for a child to learn patience when everything in life is only one tap away. That's also when we realize this story was never just about children. It has always been about the future of an entire generation. Every child today will grow up. They'll become the bus drivers who take your children to school, the nurses caring for patients in hospitals, the servers working in restaurants, the engineers building our cities, the teachers standing in front of classrooms, the people running businesses. And one day, they themselves will become the parents of the next generation. That's why this story was never just about childhood. It's about the future of an entire society. Every generation is shaped by the environment it grows up in. The generation that lived through war carried the memory of hardship. The generation that came of age during an economic boom learned to believe in stability. And today's children will carry the unique marks of their own era. No one knows exactly what the future will look like. But history makes one thing very clear. The way children grow up today will shape the way adults act tomorrow. Not just how they learn, but how they work together, how they resolve conflict, how they build families, how they raise children, how they trust other people, and how they face the pressures that always come with adult life. That's why many experts are no longer asking questions only about technology. They're beginning to ask questions about the environment in which children grow up. Because technology will keep changing. But childhood only happens once. A child can learn to use new software at 20, but it's much harder to go back to being 8 years old to learn how to make friends, how to be patient, or how to read the emotions on another person's face. Some skills can only be built during the years when the brain and emotions are still developing. If that window is missed, learning those skills later will always be more difficult. Perhaps that's what worries so many people. Not because today's children are less intelligent. And not because technology is something bad, but because while the world is changing faster than ever before, we're still trying to answer a very old question. What truly helps a person grow into a healthy adult? Perhaps the answer hasn't changed nearly as much as we think. A child still needs to be heard, needs conversations, needs to fail, needs to wait, needs to step into the real world and understand that life doesn't always go the way they want it to. Because in the end, the future of a nation isn't determined by the phones its children use. It's determined by the people those children will become 20 years from now. Perhaps the most frightening thing isn't that everything is changing so fast. It's that we're gradually becoming used to those changes. What do you think is the single most important thing a child needs to have a healthy childhood in today's world? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this video meaningful, don't forget to like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.